You're listening to an IOE podcast from the UCL Institute of Education. Powered by UCL Minds.
This is Research for the Real World. Conversations with researchers about the paths they've taken to shape our everyday lives.
This is Research for the Real World. Hello, I'm Keri Wong. I'm an assistant professor here at the IOE. This season, we're focusing on the climate crisis. With the COP26 summit being held in Glasgow, there's a clear link between the role of education and raising awareness about the world we live in. Therefore, as a team, we wanted to explore that a bit further. So in this episode, I'm delighted to be talking with Dr. Charlotte Nussey. Charlotte is a postdoctoral research fellow at the UCL Institute of Education, based in the Department of Education, Practice, and Society, and the Center for Education and International Development. Her research focuses on education and intersecting inequalities, particularly around gender, climate, and violence, and through qualitative research methods. She has worked as a consultant on a range of education and international development projects, including participatory research into sustainable development in Liberia, Sierra Leone, Kenya, and Zambia. Her most recent publication in the Journal of Oxford Development Studies focuses on the relationship between structural inequalities and discourses around educational exclusion. Hello, Charlotte. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Keri. Real pleasure to be with you today.
Thanks for joining us. So just to get our conversation going, maybe starting off with a kind of easy question as well for our listeners to get to know you a bit. How did you become involved in education? And can you tell us a bit more about your experience at university? Where has that taken you?
So my first degree was in classics, which doesn't have really a clear link to international development. But I guess the thread that runs through all of my career and all of my research interest is around languages. So I was really interested in learning and teaching languages. And so I started my career as a teacher for 4 years, teaching languages. And as part of that, I was a volunteer teacher in Tanzania. And so I was invited to go because the Tanzanian secondary school education system is in English. And they wanted qualified language teachers to go and support English teaching in Tanzania. And so while I was in Tanzania, lots of kind of questions around the role of English, the former colonial relationship with the country, the reasons why English was even being taught at all kind of really came to the fore. And so I decided to study education and international development at UCL to kind of critically engage with those kinds of questions.
That's fantastic. It's a long way to travel, isn't it? But great experience, I'm sure. So let's take this step by step. What are the Sustainable Development Goals and how do they relate to the environment?
So the Sustainable Development Goals are a kind of global agenda which had much more of a participatory and a kind of engaged discussion leading up to them than their predecessors, the Millennium Development Goals, which were launched in 2000. So the Sustainable Development Goals were launched in 2015 and we're still in the middle of them. They're running until 2030 and there are 16 different goals. Climate features as the 13th goal specifically, which is a goal around climate action, but it also features in lots of the other goals. For example, Goal 7 is around energy, Goal 11 around sustainable cities, and then also sustainable life on land and water. So there are lots of different ways in which climate and the environment are really embedded in the goals. And the way that I'm really interested in the goals is how that relates to education, which is Sustainable Development Goal 4.
That's fantastic. And that leads right into my next question, actually, very nicely. And how do these goals then feature in education?
So the educational goal really is a goal around quality, educational quality. The Millennium Development Goals, which were the predecessors, really focused on access to education. And there's been a shift in the Sustainable Development Goals around quality. So an inclusive and equitable quality education for all is the focus of SDG 4. But SDG Target 4.7 really expands that focus. So brings in some of the questions about citizenship, around cultures, around gender equality, freedom from violence in terms of your learning. And so there's a real kind of linking together in Target 4.7 of lots of different dimensions about what it means to live and to learn in the world. That idea in the Sustainable Development Goals is really prevalent around people and planet together. And so there's lots of ways in which people within the development sector are trying to draw links between different goals, between education and climate or education and gender equality.
Great. So, from my understanding, Charlie, that you're also working with Dr. Andrea Rigon from the UCL Bartlett School. How have you found working across campus? And also, how did the collaboration start in the first place?
Oh, thanks, Keri. Yes, that project has now actually finished. It finished in the end of 2019 when I actually went on to maternity leave. But working across campus was a really rewarding experience. It's been really important, I think, as part of my career to work in interdisciplinary ways. And so Andrea had a huge wealth of experience around participatory research, but also through urban development and the role of cities in sustainable development, which I think I learned a huge amount from through that partnership. The partnership started because I was invited to do a guest lecture on one of the modules at the DPU, which was again a really interesting process to be working with lots of people thinking about gender and gender equality, but from very different perspectives. And so I was invited to give a guest lecture on education, gender and policy planning around education. And then the kind of partnership with lots of colleagues developed from that focus and from that collaboration. So I worked for about a year, the project lasted, with Andrea on the Bringing Agenda 2030 to Life consultancy.
Yeah, just can you double click on that a little bit? What was that project about, and what are some of the key take-home messages from that project?
So that project was really thinking about how this broad agenda, Bringing Agenda 2030 to Life was the title, and it was really thinking about how that broad agenda translated differently and was localized differently in different country contexts in sub-Saharan Africa. And so it was thinking about the project within the context of Liberia, Sierra Leone, Kenya, and Zambia, through extensive engagement with academics in those countries, with civil society in those countries, with government, with media, with all sorts of different stakeholders who were working on development. And so we were really bringing people together through a participatory methodology into a workshop to discuss the work that was already happening in the country, to think about the kinds of work that they'd already been engaged in, and to think about then how that work could shift, could evolve in dialogue with the Sustainable Development Goals.
That's fantastic. I'm sure it must have been so interesting hearing all these perspectives, bringing it all together, and then seeing the project complete as well at the end. So I know that also from your latest work or most recent work, that's on a project called Climate U. So can you tell us a little bit, just briefly, about the project aims, and then more specifically about your role in this project?
Sure. So Climate U is called Transforming Universities for a Changing Climate in full. And it's a 3-year GCRF funded project. The GCRF projects are the Global Challenge Research Fund projects, and they all have a particular dimension around trying to challenge some of the kind of traditional power dynamics associated with research that's funded by countries in the global north. So they're designed to really take a partnership approach to research. So we're looking at the potential role of universities in responding to the climate crisis in 4 lower and middle income countries: in Brazil, in Fiji, in Kenya, and Mozambique. And my role really within the project is a kind of coordinating one. I work with partners in all of those 4 countries. We have 12 university partners, as well as an increasing range of affiliate university partners. Part of my role is to really think creatively around how to enhance the impact from the beginning of that project. So, for example, we've been really keen to have lots of different modes of sharing knowledge, and we are developing a green or a living library, which is a full set of resources which will be on the website, open access. We also have open access resources through the specific forms of research that we're doing. So the survey that we're delivering in 12 universities to 1,000 students in each, that survey questionnaire will be available online, as are our participatory tools and knowledge exchange seminars. So the idea is to really start and to generate a conversation around how universities can respond to climate change.
Wow, that sounds like you have a lot on your plate and lots of different things and stakeholders to juggle. I'm just curious, from a researcher standpoint, kind of obviously you have to liaise with so many different parties and different time zones as well. What are some, I guess, challenges or even, tools that have been very helpful for you in project managing this project?
I think it's really interesting because I started 2 weeks before the UK was locked down. So the entire experience of working on this project has been a virtual one. But actually, we've reflected a lot that that's entirely appropriate within the context of researching climate change. The old model of academics flying around and having all sorts of kind of meetings for a day and then flying back again is just completely inappropriate within the context that we're working in. And so that's been a real challenge. I haven't met any of my colleagues in person, apart from my colleagues who are also based in London. My colleagues in Fiji have had all sorts of internet connectivity issues as well. In Mozambique, it's been a real challenge. But I think what we've tried to do is to see it as an opportunity. So try to really develop innovative participatory methodologies that are virtual through things like these knowledge exchange seminars where they can be watched whatever time of the day that you're watching them. And of course, Fiji is 12 hours apart from the UK, so that's really varied. But I think all of these modern technologies for research, using WhatsApp, using Jamboard, using Google Classroom, all of these different kinds of technologies really become important, and have also been really important ways to think about connecting universities with broader coalitions of communities around the climate crisis that are really part of their work and part of their thinking. So setting up, for example, a green office in southern Brazil, they've used Instagram as one of their ways to engage students who don't normally have a participatory kind of decision-making role in sustainable governance within their universities. So there's been a huge range of kind of work that we've done, I guess, through the pandemic, driven through the pandemic, but then thinking about how even when we come out of this strange world associated with COVID, going back to normal is not appropriate.
Mm-hmm. That's so interesting you say that, because it sounds like, everyone's kind of stuck at home, even though we're connecting to people or collaborators abroad, all over the world. And you're actually saying there are some advantages to that. I'm curious to learn a little bit more about perhaps, do you think there's real opportunity in the pandemic, but do you think this has actually driven more kind of creative ways of thinking about research impact and dissemination methods and things like that through the technology you mentioned?
I think it has. I think there is, of course, something that is lost without face-to-face interactions. And I think we do need to recognize that. And I think I don't agree with what some of the technology companies might perhaps have us believe, that, you can do everything virtually. But I do think that there are certain ways of connecting that have really broadened access. So our first webinar, for example, we had a huge participation from countries all over the world. And I think that broadening that access, whether it's in terms of, disability in terms of coming into a physical space, or in terms of those huge power dynamics of the difference in terms of being able to participate in those kinds of academic events between the global north and the global south, perhaps there's a way to trouble some of those dynamics through the virtual methodologies.
And I guess all the listeners on the call, just watch this space. There's going to be more to come from Charlotte and her team. And just to end off our conversation, do you have any upcoming projects that you'd like to share with our listeners?
I guess there are two projects that I'm really passionate about that are still ongoing, in addition to the Climate U work, which I'm sure you can hear is a real passion of mine. The first is a collaborative global engagement fund project that I've been working on with a colleague at the University of South Pacific in Fiji. So one of our research partners is currently in the community at the moment, filming community perspectives on Indigenous knowledge and on education and the ways that these can feed into climate change. And so she's in the community working together with a range of colleagues there to make a film that was funded in part by the IOE. And so it's designed to be an advocacy tool in the run-up to COP, but also in the work that we do as educators and as policymakers to respond to COP, because there's all of this momentum around COP, the Conference of the Parties, which is going to be in Glasgow in November of this year. And what we really don't want is just to see all of that momentum and then it trickle away without leading to actually any action. So the idea is to translate that process into sustained change. And so having a video and having some visual engagement with what it looks like to live and to learn into Fiji is part of that project. And then the second thing that I'm involved in that I think is really important is to really think about development differently. I'm part of a decolonial study collective at UCL Centre for Education and International Development. And I think what I've really learned by engaging with climate justice, particularly over the last 5 years, is that it really challenges us in terms of how we think about development. It really turns those old categories of developed and developing on their heads, because actually it's the developed world which really needs to change in terms of our emissions and the ways that we structure our systems and societies. So really working with some fantastic colleagues at UCL on that decolonial movement has been really hugely inspiring and a great source of learning and unlearning in terms of how to think about the field.
So you've been working with a lot of other partners in the Pacific, South America, and Africa. What have their perspectives been, especially with the COP summit?
I think that's a huge topic of discussion. And I think the difference in this COP particularly is that the evidence for the climate crisis is unequivocal. We had the recent IPCC report, the physical science, the basis for climate change. And that report from the first working group really raises the bar in terms of responding to the crisis. There's no question that it's happening, and there's no question that it's happening now. And I think what my colleagues, and I don't want to speak for them, but I think that my colleagues would really want people within the UK, in the ways that I've been talking about, to really reflect on our own ability to respond to the crisis immediately, because they're already living through the effects of the crisis. We have one university partner in northern Brazil, where we've seen huge devastation to the Amazon, and that's one of the potential tipping points around the climate. In Fiji, there are communities that are already having to be relocated because of sea level rises and increasing floods, severity of cyclones. And in sub-Saharan Africa, of course, Cyclone Idai, which many people will have heard of, which hit Mozambique so severely. And of course, all of these things have an impact on education. People are not able to learn when the environment is so severely affecting the infrastructure. But also the reverse is true, that it's really important for education to respond to the crisis in the ways that we've learned from Greta Thunberg. It's not something that we can just ignore. It's not something that can't be part of our practice, part of our teaching, part of our learning. So I think I was talking to my colleague, Rosianna Lagi, and I think what the message that people really want to take to COP this year is that it's urgent, that now is the time, and now is the time for action, and that we can't ignore it. And I think what we probably have seen in recent times with the fires in the US, with the flooding, for example, in the UK and Germany, actually is that it's affecting countries, as I say, that, you know, we might describe as developed, in the same way that it's affecting countries that we might describe as developing.
What are their perspectives like?
I think one of the things that's been really interesting for us as part of the Climate U project is to run this huge survey with students to ask how they feel about the crisis. And one of the most interesting for us emergent findings is that students are in the main responding that they are learning about the climate through their work at universities, but the vast majority say they'd like to learn more. Very few of the students in our survey responded that they felt satisfied with the level of the teaching. And so our partners in Kenya are conducting a really fascinating critical review of lots of different courses within the 3 institutions that participate in our studies, really trying to think about how to transform their curricula, transform the kind of campus operations that exist around climate, so that they can really speak to that student desire to learn more and to understand more the crisis. I guess what's interesting for me in terms of the 2 different parts of my work that you've picked up is this idea of participation. And it also comes through in terms of how we understand the GCRF projects, and this idea that comes from particularly post-2015 and Roads Must Fall and the decolonising movements around education, to really think differently around knowledge and power and the ways that those translate into education and development. And so I think one of the things that's really interesting about those participatory methodologies is that we're really seeing the power of understanding not just knowledge that goes from universities to communities, but the knowledge that comes back from communities to universities, and how that's really got a kind of transformative potential in the ways of thinking about those 2-way flows of knowledge, of ideas, that we don't necessarily think about in terms of education. I think that's been something that's been really powerful, that's come through that participatory lens. And lots of our partners seem to have found that really generative in terms of the kinds of excitement and energy that brings to the work that they've been doing.
You know, there's in the past couple, decades, as we hear about climate change all the time, but I think for me, it's more about, well, what is the day-to-day thing that we can be doing? Like, what's the kind of small actions and behaviors that we should all be doing now? And maybe people don't hear that often enough. They just hear climate change is happening, but then they don't hear the action points. And I wonder what your thoughts are in terms of what would you recommend as kind of where would one start if they wanted to take action?
I think that's a huge question, Keri. It's a really nice one, but it's a huge question. I think what the educational research is telling us is that it's not that we don't know that climate change is happening. So I think that that's a really important message. Within the SDG framework, they talk about awareness, training, and education as kind of being key ways of responding to the crisis. And I think what we're finding is that it's not awareness that's the problem. We know climate change is happening. We know climate change is happening now. And so I think in terms of action, there's a lot of tension and a lot of kind of creative thinking around that tension between individual actions and collective action. And I think really what we fundamentally need to understand is that what we need to do is to divest from fossil fuels. We need to stop fossil fuel production. We need to have new and different sources of energy. And so writing to government, putting pressure on government, acting at that kind of big structural policy level. So just writing to your MP, raising the concern, making it clear that it is a topic that you care about is one small action that's really important. And then I think there are loads of really excellent books that you can engage with that are designed to think about the crisis, not in terms of a kind of paralyzing fear or an anxiety about it, which some people suggest leads to inaction, but from a space of hope and from a space of agency that, yes, it's happening now, but it isn't too late. We can act. There are things that we can do. So things like The Future We Choose is a really nice book. Professor Mark Maslin's really written a really interesting book. There's also the Climate Action Unit here at UCL, which is a group of people that come together around communication, bringing together lots of different forms of research. And I think you've already discussed, you can follow Sustainable UCL for lots of different ideas and lots of different short actions that you can take. But I think one of the messages that I found really powerful through starting to engage with activism is that we need both a sense of individual responsibility, but also collective change, that no one thing that you can do is going to be enough, and that we need a kind of whole-scale system change to really respond to the crisis. And that might relate to responding and transforming education systems in the way that we've been talking about today.
Yes, I completely agree with you. And there's lots of food for thought for us there too. Charlotte, it has been really interesting talking with you. And I myself learned a lot from this conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Keri.
You can follow Charlotte on Twitter at Nussey C to learn more about her research and her colleagues' research at Twitter UCL_global. Some of what we covered today are also available in the episode notes. We've had some fascinating guests on the podcast, a real variation in topics and expertise across social science and education. Search IOE Podcast from wherever you get your podcasts, and to find episodes from seasons 1 to 10. Can you believe it? 10 of Research for the Real World, as well as more podcasts from the IOE. I'm Keri. See you next time. Research for the Real World is brought to you by the IOE Marketing and Communications team,
in association with IOE Research Development.
This podcast is presented by me, Dr. Keri Wong,
and me, Dr. Sam Sims.
The theme music was created by Rob Cochran.
Tatiana Sotero Diaz is the series advisor.
Amy Leibowitz is the series producer.
And Jason Illigan is the executive producer of the IOE podcast.
Thanks so much for downloading and listening to this IOE podcast from the UCL Institute of Education, University College London.